Okay, one second. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor at Howard University, and this is the hashtag Slaveryarchive book club hosted by me and Alex Gill from Yale University, who is here with us. And today we're very happy to be hosting historian Roquinaldo Ferreira, who will be talking about his new book, Worlds of Unfreedom, West Central Africa in the Era of Global Abolition. Roquinaldo Ferreira is historian and Henry Charles Lea Professor of History, specializing in African, Atlantic, and Brazilian history. And before coming to University of Pennsylvania in 2018, he taught at University of Virginia, and then also taught at Brown University, where he was the Vasco da Gama Chair and Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Professor Ferreira has held then several professorships in several universities around the world, including then the University Agostinho Neto in Luanda, Angola, l'Institut de Hautes Études Internationales du Développement in Geneva, Switzerland, and the École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, France. And his research has been supported by the American Council of Learning Societies, ACLS, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Portuguese Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, and also by the Brazilian Conselho Nacional de Desenvolvimento Científico e Tecnológico. Professor Ferreira is the author, then his previous book, single author book, is Cross-Cultural Exchange in the Atlantic World, Angola and Brazil during the era of the slave trade, that was published in 2012 with Cambridge University Press. And Professor Ferreira has also then his books, previous books then published in Portuguese, also published in Angola. He has also a recent book edited with Lucilene Reginaldo and published in Brazil. All of us, we use and widely cite the work of Professor Ferreira, which is really a central reference for all of us doing the writing and researching the history of Atlantic slave trade and the slavery, and especially then the history of the South Atlantic world. Thank you, Rocky, for being here with us and for presenting this great book that was just published then with University of Princeton University Press, and this is a book that was just published then in June of 2025. Welcome, Rocky.
So let me just begin by saying that it is a real pleasure to be here with so many friends. I thank Ana Lucia and Alex for the invitation, and then I look forward to the conversation. The book just came out. This is a book that was pretty much ready to go many, many years ago, and the joke that I've been telling people is that don't ever go back to the manuscript to change anything. My goal at the time was, with the manuscript pretty much ready to go, I wanted to go back to fix a few things, and that took me like 5 years. So for our conversation today, I think what I want to do, and I'm going to be following an outline here, I want to use the vignette or the anecdote about Imbundu, which is who is the character that I use to open up the book, his trajectory, his elements of his story, to articulate several points about the book. And the reason why I'm doing this is because me encountering him in the archives was what really shaped the book. So the fragments of his trajectory that I was able to find, not much. We all know that we wrestle with this archive to find like bits and pieces of information. So when I came across Imbundu and his escape from the slave trade, that was a big deal for me. Was actually quite, I would even dare to say, a little bit emotional, because we don't get that voice in the archives every day. And here I was facing or hearing this voice that was speaking powerfully about resistance to the slave trade from the bottom up. It felt like this is taking me to the very heart, to the very core of the system, and I can see someone pushing back on this system, this horrendous system of the slave trade. So the book pushed back on views of, abolition that frame abolition around external forces, and the idea is to reframe this conversation or recenter this conversation around Africa and Africans. When it comes to the historiography, we have a lot about abolition throughout the Americas, but we have information. The book has a lot of dialogue, historiographical dialogues. So we do have scholarship on abolition in Africa, but I felt like Mbundu was telling me a different story. It was telling me a story that had to do with the process of suppressing the slave trade itself, to African participation in bringing that system down, the system that had been ongoing for, say, 300 years. So through him, I felt like I could make a set of points challenging the historiography, challenging the imbalances in the historiography, and bringing African voices to the shore, to the fore. So Mbundu, this is 1856, and he escaped a slave trade caravan. About 40 people were being taken to the coast. Together with other people, he was able to run away. He then came across a caravan or expedition, actually, a military expedition made up of Portuguese and African soldiers going inland. This is a big deal because that means like territorial expansion on the part of the Portuguese, and we are going to be delving into that pretty soon. But Mbundu came across those soldiers, and the soldiers would rescue him, quote unquote. And the first point is that he gave intelligence about the slave trade to these folks. He told them about the networks of the slave trade on the ground. And that felt like very, very powerful to me in terms of participation, this pushing back on the slave trade. I could feel that. However, Mbundu, he did escape the slave trade, but he did not escape these new systems of slavery or forced labor that were coming into being at that point in time. So Mbundu, for me, through his trajectory, in a way, it is a trajectory that encapsulates four elements that for me are very important when it comes to abolition in the African context and beyond. First is the impact of this demand for labor force in the Americans on the African side. And the specificity of Mbundu's case is that we are talking about 1856. So there's no longer a slave trade to Brazil. So we're talking about a slave trade geared towards Cuba, exacting a very heavy toll on Africa. So Cuba is driving the process at this point in time. We know a lot about the connection with Brazil. So for me, that was interesting because, it hinted at this connection with Cuba. It felt like we need to know more about this. We need to know about the intricacies of these networks connecting Cuba to West Central Africa. The second point that I felt like the Mbundu trajectory was telling me was about something that I just said: intelligence, participation, African agency in the context of ending the slave trade. I felt like through him, we could get to know more about the African side of this story. We could get to know more about a story that usually is pretty one-dimensional, right? Because it's usually told in a way that emphasizes external players, European players, state players, economic players, elite players. And with Mbundu, I felt like we could complicate this picture. The third point for me was that, you have an expedition that's being dispatched from Luanda well into the lower Congo. This is a really big deal. I knew that much. I mean, the Portuguese were players in terms of the internal politics of the Kingdom of Congo. That had been the case since the 16th century. However, sending a military expedition into the region, well, it for me was a turning point. Okay, it shows a degree of influence, of projecting power that was highly unusual. So I wanted to know more about that. So I felt like this one paragraph about Ubuntu, I felt like I could make a lot out of it. A fourth element was that the very fact that he was able to escape from the slave trade, but then eventually, that's what I came to realize, became a forced worker. For me, that would help me complicate the narrative of abolition, which is a narrative that's, in a way, is still teleological, because it's a narrative that seems to point towards freedom. And I couldn't see any freedom, either with Imbundo's case, in the case of Imbundo, in the case of many other people that I came to analyze. All I could see was unfreedom. And unfreedom for me actually is not only forced labor, it's broader than that. So Imbundo was encapsulating four key points for me in terms of this reframing, the possibility of reframing abolition in that specific context of West Central Africa. So unfreedom is a big deal here. Okay? And like I just said, I mean unfreedom in a broader way. It's more capacious than forced labor. Forced labor is one manifestation of unfreedom. But unfreedom, frame it in a wider and broader way, it also includes a wider spectrum of constraints that abolition generated. The book lays out a critique of abolition, okay, making the point that abolition becomes the driving force behind this process of creation of unfreedom. And unfreedom, for me, are legal regimes that will curtail mobility, for example. I see unfreedom in systems of taxation, or taxation system that will compel people, local people, force them to participate in the colonial economies that are on the rise. I see unfreedom as well in the social dependence that are going to be reconfigured away from kinship and more along the lines of slavery, or new forms of labor regimes akin to slavery. So unfreedom is not only forced labor for me. That's why I chose to use that on the title as a way of challenging as well and complicating this notion that, what comes after abolition is freedom. It's not that. It is a point, by the way, that's being made by other people. The book is it's organized around historiographical conversations. Nothing here takes place in a void at all. But the point that I try to make, that I try to highlight, is that it's the hinge or the link between abolition itself, the legal architecture of abolition, enabling the creation of unfreedom. The treaties, the laws, all that, setting the stage for all these forms of unfreedom that I'm interested in. So there is an element of complication there that I try to add to this conversation about abolition creating, not paving the way to freedom. Let me just expand on the first point quickly, and I know that I don't have much time, and nor do I want to speak for too long because I'm interested in the conversation. Cuba is a big deal here. There is a historiography that connects Cuba to Africa, obviously. I'm not going to delve into the details. I don't want to bog us down with too many names here. However, this historiography usually connects Cuba to West Africa, or to Senegambia. Okay? We know far less about the connection between Cuba and West Central Africa than we should. And we need to know a lot about that because that region is the key African region connected to Cuba. So the book does that. It fills in that gap. The second point, which is the point about African participation in this process of ending the slave trade. We know that the archives will, I'm not going to say ours, but by and large, it will privilege the voices of elite people, okay, administrators, merchants, governors, missionaries. But sometimes, at crucial times, we can see enslaved people like in Bundu shaping events on the ground by refusing to participate in this system of coerced labor, by escaping, by subverting the system, and sometimes working through official channels to take on the slave trade. So Mbundu was a big deal for me, finding him, but he was only the tip of the iceberg. There is a whole chapter dealing with Africans taking on the slave trade through several ways, not only running away like Mbundu did, but also providing information to the Portuguese like he also did, reporting pending or impending attempts of slave trade like many other people did, to the extent that the Portuguese would even change the legislation to incentivize this kind of behavior by Africans. There's a whole rationale to explain why Portugal is doing that, okay? Why Portugal would enable Africans to do that. Why Portugal would reward Africans who did that, okay? And we can get into the details here later on. But the point is not to romanticize anything at all. It's just like what the sources are telling us. This is like an overwhelming amount of sources that we find in multiple archives. And the goal here is to reshape this conversation from the bottom up. Okay? And the point is to recognize agency where the record allows us to make a point about resistance, to make a point about people taking on the systems that try to commodify their lives. Agency here will appear in many ways. It's not only about resistance. It's not only about one type of resistance. Okay? Agency will appear in the grain of the everyday life. Okay? An informant at a feitoria, for example, it's going to be like a commercial hub on the coast. Okay? A revolt, the classic way, right? But it could also be like, you know, collaborating with the Portuguese. There are many ways we can envision agency taking place on the ground. So I'm not confined to a one-dimension definition of agency. And I do think that these multiple examples allow us to reorient this story, allow us to think not only about laws and treaties, but also about people and the forces that changed this history from the bottom up. I think it is important to inject that dimension into the conversation. This is not unfamiliar for people who work on slavery throughout the Americas. This is in the context of the African context. We also have people making this kind of argument in the context of ending slavery itself. I'm making that point in the context of specifically of the slave trade. Okay? So I just want to make that point very clear. The third point here that I see through Mbundu's life is the way that abolition, through its language and legal architecture, will set the stage for what we could call empire making. The Portuguese are not isolated here by sending expeditions into Africa or military expeditions, sometimes scientific expeditions. Other European powers were doing the same around the same time. Okay, and so abolition for me here is part of this process of encroachment on the African continent, which will take a toll in terms of African sovereignty. And in this specific case, it takes a very militaristic form, which is very interesting. It's not only one expedition, but they did send multiple expeditions into the lower Congo. That will have like an impact in terms of what Portugal could do at the time in terms of meddling into the internal politics of the Kingdom of Congo. At that time, the Kingdom of Congo was going through a succession crisis. And by sending that expedition to the kingdom at that point in time, Portugal actually gained a lot of leverage, not only militarily speaking, but also politically speaking, in terms of meddling into this crisis that was simmering at the time. Eventually, the Portuguese were able to manipulate the system to pretty much choose the person who became the next king of Congo. So it has a real impact on the ground. The fourth point that I want to make is about labor regimes, okay? Unfreedom defined it in a more narrow way, okay? The fact that Mbunda was taken inland and ended up as a forced laborer, or worker in that mining or copper mining or mine is a big deal. It is illustrative of wider processes. I deal with that in one of the chapters of the book, and I frame that as a process that, in order to be clearly understood, needs to be placed in a global frame. So what takes place in Angola is also, it is a manifestation of processes that are going to be taking place as far away as the Indian Ocean. The use of the language of abolition to justify, enable, and sometimes even create new forms of forced labor. In the Angolan context specifically, but not only, in other places too, the mechanism of apprenticeship was critical. People would be held under apprenticeship for 10, 12, 7 years, and sometimes on the hope and on the assumption that eventually they would make their way out of slavery altogether. So that was supposed to be a transitional stage, except that oftentimes people would just get stuck as an apprentice. They would never really become fully free. All that in the name of abolition. The legal architecture organizing all this comes from abolition. So I think there is a link, a very clear link between abolition and these coercive systems that are created in the wake of the slave trade. The book also deals with gender and the Lunda kingdom, the multiple manifestations of slavery and the instability of slavery on the ground, different regimes of slavery coexisting alongside each other, both in the Lunda Empire, but also closer to the coast. I see this all through the lenses of Unfreedom. So you have a multiplicity of systems of coercion coming into being at that point in time. Some of them actually represent some sort of continuity from what had taken place prior to this era of abolition. But there are many, many novelties that are enabled by abolition itself. I want to return to the human texture that microhistory keeps in view. A lot of the book is organized around the idea of microhistory as a methodology. Consider, for example, language. Language, the Kongo language, which becomes like a point of, a unifying point for people like Mbundu. On the ground, the fact that they could rely on that language that was spoken, variations of the language that was spoken on the ground in the lower Congo, that makes a difference. So the microhistory here is to consider people as human beings, okay, on these interactions on the ground. The language is important here. Body marks are important too. By looking at Mbundu and other people like him, we can realize that how scarification was a point that would allow people to connect to each other. It was a language, and a language that could be leveraged as a tool against the slave trade. So all these findings, quote unquote, I came to that through the lenses of microhistory, by paying very close attention to people on the ground. So the idea here is to go from the micro to the macro and coming back to the micro. So there's the different levels of analysis. I organized both the research and the book around those principles. These fragments, I would say, they do not romanticize suffering. They help us reconstruct experience, showing people how people made sense of the upheavals of Atlantic slavery. And they help us understand personhood under conditions determined to deny it. So all this, let me just distill the book's claims then. For me, this is an African-centered abolition. That was clear in my mind from the get-go, that I would want to write a book like that, centered around people, centered around Africa. For me, too, and that became clear over time, abolition is more of provides the infrastructure for empire, for the expansion of empire. The third point here is the point that I made before, unfreedom after slavery. Okay. Ending the transatlantic slave trade did not end coercion, obviously. It converted, often through law, into contracts, taxes, penal labor. The fourth point for me is this issue of global history, the global engagement. Okay. So methodologically speaking, the book tries to marry microhistory and global history. Global history is important, the global entanglement is important, because West Central Africa, the history of West Central Africa at this point in time, cannot be told within a single ocean. It is braided into Atlantic, but also Indian Ocean circuits of capital, people, and ideas. I began with Mbundu to resist this flattening of the past. We will never know much about his interior life, what he thought when he met the soldiers, how he felt exactly as his life was upended by the slave trade. But we can reconstruct the worlds that surrounded him. Through his body, through the scarifications, through the languages, through life in a village, we can build up a profile of him. And in doing so, we can bring him back into a narrative of African history that sometimes is very difficult to relate to because it's too structural, it's too top-down. To study this history, I would say, is to accept two obligations. Okay? That's how I work this out in my mind. One is analytical. Okay? We want to understand how systems that converted lives into labor and wealth, we want to understand how these systems really function. We want to chart them, the dismantling of this system, We want to understand how they were reinvented. We want to analyze. We want to take a distance from this object. Okay? But the other dimension is more ethical. It was ethical for me. And through those lenses, for me, it's about keeping individual lives visible, to attend to the voices that archives try to efface sometimes, okay? And to write a history in which people like Mbundu are not only remembered as victims, but recognized as agents, however constrained they were, of their own histories. Okay? That was the point of the book for me. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you so much. And then I can see all your faces. I don't know how, if you already have questions, then I would ask you to raise your hand using Zoom, and then you'll be able to unmute you once you raise your hand. And let me pin Alex as well. Let's see who would like to start.
Tatiana. I see Tatiana raising her actual hand. Yes.
Okay, someone who is raising an actual right hand?
Tatiana.
Tatiana?
Tatiana says.
Okay, Tatiana, go ahead. Can you unmute yourself?
I just did. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Okay, congratulations. It's a wondrous work. As always, your work just is so inspiring. So thank you for sharing it with this group. Having read it and now having heard you, I wondered if you could maybe talk about the kind of imperial echoes, thinking about the history of empire building in America and empire building in Africa. You know, your connection of unfreedom and abolition is so interesting to me because, of course, in the 1500s, Spain is building an empire in which it's claiming towards indigenous people that we protect you from enslavement, but now you have to give us high taxes, high tribute in terms of labor and as well as in goods. So, you know, you kind of touch on that a little bit, and you talked about it just now, how unfreedom comes in terms of establishing these onerous tax systems. So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, maybe in terms of an example of a person who you might have found who is kind of calling attention to this. It's a new era of, it's unfreedom by measure of, I still have to deliver to the state this, you know, this, my work or goods that really does seem like I am unfree. Thank you.
Should I answer now? Anna?
Yes, you can.
Okay. The imperial side of the story for me, and this is chapter 1, is the remaking of the Portuguese Empire in the South Atlantic. It's very 19th century centered. It has a lot to do with ending, it has a lot to do with the loss of Brazil, right? And what happens after Portugal lost Brazil. And this attempt of recentering the Portuguese Empire around Africa, and in this case, around West Central Africa. So this is a history that's top down in a way. It has to be top down because it is driven by the Portuguese state. It's not overnight. It's going to take 30 years for this process to come into fruition, but it is also a process that would not have taken place without the participation of local players in Angola and West Central Africa, broadly defined. So you have people funding the expeditions, for example. There are people individuals, members of the elite, businessmen, businesswomen, that will be the architects of this remaking of the Portuguese imperial system in this area. It's not, it is a process that sometimes it falls way short of what they wanted to accomplish. But I would say that it kind of it lays the groundwork for the buildup that takes place in the 1860s. So I don't know, to answer your question, I don't know how much that overlaps with the 16th century. I see lots of specificities here. Generally speaking, when we consider the 19th century, we see, I would say, we see colonialism kind of fading away across the Americas and moving elsewhere, right? We see the British doing that. We see the French do that big times. The Portuguese had an edge here because they had a footprint in Africa. The French had that too in Senegal, right? And they were very good in terms of leveraging that to make inroads in West Central Africa. But I see specificity when it comes to the 19th century. Unfreedom, let me just try to address that. Unfreedom is huge, but the networks and the infrastructure of colonialism are going to be heavier in the area in the 19th century. It is no longer, it's not going to be like in the past, just like along the coast. They're going to try to move inland. Not easy to accomplish that, but they did a lot. They did quite a bit.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Tatiana. And now I see Ashley. Then I will add you. Can you can unmute yourself, I guess.
Okay, I
Yes.
think I'm unmuted now, right?
Okay. Yes.
All right. Hi, Hoki. Congratulations on this wonderful book. I wanted to ask two questions, and one is about the differences in the kinds of documents that you found in different areas here, and to what extent the granularity and the individual accounts that emphasize different forms of agency and specific experiences that are present in your book are shaped by the archives that were that was available to you. The second question that I have is with regards to West Central Africa. And so there's a clear point here about how important it was during this specific time period, with 70% of the slave trade being from this region. But does this mean, like, would we be able to create similar histories of abolition that equally emphasize the roles of Africans for different parts of the continent? So I've been trying to work with abolition narratives from Mozambique, and you can get to the voices of Africans in very indirect manners in travel narratives or the narratives of missionaries. But I wonder, if it would be possible to do it, or especially if it would be possible to do it for West Africa. Maybe not in the same ways, or does the fact that the main role is played by West Central Africa actually, make it impossible or, less likely to be able to engage in similar efforts for different parts of the continent?
So thanks for the question. They are intertwined actually. The archives are very rich. That doesn't mean that we will just come across the data overnight. It takes a very long time to collect everything, as you know, well. But that is quite a bit, I would say. I mean, by relying on sources from, and the British were in the area too at that point in time, so you can you can take advantage of that as well. And you have travelers from France, a few of them coming into the area. But I would say that largely what I found is difficult to quantify, but there's a lot in Portugal. But my sense was that if I could focus on local archives, I could then tap into these local dynamics. That was the assumption from the beginning in terms of the research that I did. People would say just like, back to 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people would say, don't even bother to go to Angola because the documents there are going to be copies of what you find in Portugal. That was not the case. Of course, sometimes you do find copies, but I would say that generally speaking, you find documents that are very specific to this, that speak really well to these local dynamics that I was interested in. And more importantly, you find a lot of them. So you can multiply the number of actors, you can multiply the number of voices. From the beginning, the goal was to immerse myself into these archives, to excavate the archives as much as I could, and to go to places where very few people, I was not the only one doing that, by the way. Other people do that and do that extremely well. Okay, I just want to make that clear. There are like a new generation of scholars doing that these days. Some of them are here. And I think they're going to go deeper and further than anyone else, just because they have more energy than we do. Regarding Mozambique, I was in Mozambique and over the summer. I'm very interested in things related to the island of Ilha de Mozambique, island of Mozambique. Not about abolition or anything, it's a different project. But I did come across a lot of data, a lot of archival sources. It was very robust. So my sense is that whoever goes there, and I know a few people doing that, including yourself, whoever goes there and immerses herself into those sources should be able to find many voices, local dynamics, In other words, what I was able very modestly to do in terms of Angola, people should be able to replicate that when it comes at least to Mozambique, right? I don't know about other places. So I would say that, just to wrap this up, just has to do a little bit with the way the historiography has been shaped over time, mostly considering abolition as a process that comes from the outside, right? So by shifting the lenses to Africa itself, we can generate other questions. And to do that, obviously, we need to tap into those sources in local archives.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Ashley. Let's see if you have a next question. Let me see. I don't see any hands, but I have to go through. Okay. You have another question? Okay. Ashley has another question then. Go ahead if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, since
go
I
ahead.
was going to wait if somebody else had a question. But I was wondering if you could also elaborate a bit on another aspect of your book, which is the connections between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, which is at the heart of both the historiography and the research, and which makes it fascinating.
Yeah, for me, the point of the connector, that's how I think of that. The connector is abolition itself, which is playing out in multiple places at the same time. So I felt like if I could zoom out or step back and take a more global view or vantage point, right, of abolition, considering not only the Atlantic Ocean, and in the context of the Atlantic Ocean, by the way, putting West Central Africa in conversation with West Africa, I felt like if I could do that, that would be productive. If I could go further than that and bring the Indian Ocean into the picture, I could then generate new insights, right? That was the bet, so to speak. And in order to do that, I use the structure of abolition itself, right? The abolition with as a process that implies lots of imperial geopolitics, which will take sometimes a militaristic turn, which is not unique to the Atlantic Ocean, although that might be the most the most pronounced example of the militaristic turn. But as a process itself is playing out not only in the Atlantic but also in the Indian Ocean. In addition to that, the issue of labor regimes for me, what the Portuguese were doing in West Central Africa, and they themselves would say that they wanted to replicate what the French had done. And then they would point to these examples in many places, including in the Indian Ocean. So, and the British, by the way, because this is chapter 7, I put these three empires in conversation in terms of how to go about building new systems of freedom. And they are always quoting each other. And they were very, very good at knowing what each other were doing in their different colonies, not only in the Atlantic, but in the Indian Ocean. So the French were very proactive in assembling these new systems as well. In the Réunion Island, bringing people from East Africa, including Mozambique. And in doing so, they're engaging in conversations that are pretty global. They're very aware of that. So the impact, abolition itself provides them the vantage point to globalize this conversation, which should not be confined to a single nation or a single empire. Very clearly, that became very clear to me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Ashley. And we have a question that is coming from the chat. Then I have Natasha. Let me just see if I find you here to unmute you. Where is Natasha? Sorry, people, for this. If Alex, you see where Natasha is to unmute her. I see her in the chat, but I don't see her in my gallery. Where is she? Oh, here she is. Natasha, you can unmute yourself now.
Yes. Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So, great presentation. I'm currently in the Gambia, and the network here is really horrible. So I was able to only get bits and pieces. So forgive me for asking this question. But because I'm in the Gambia, I'm also doing research on Gambia and Senegambia in a whole. I heard you made reference to Senegambia. I was just wondering, what was that reference about?
Can I answer? Yeah, the reference was, it has to do with chapter 7 of the book. It has to do with these dialogues between dialogues, quote unquote, or the circulation of ideas between different imperial spaces, more specifically to the fact that, you know, the French, they will develop a system that's similar to the apprenticeship system, not exactly the same, okay, but with many similarities. And they will say that, by the way. And the Portuguese are also very aware and attentive to that. For example, in the case of the Portuguese, when they created this new forced migration to São Tomé and Príncipe that takes place in the 1840s and gains real momentum in the 1850s, to justify that, they will use abolition. They will say, oh, those people are free, and they will enjoy the rights of abolition in this, on São Tomé as they were taken to São Tomé. But in addition to that, they will mention these precedents set up by the British and the French. So it is in that context that Senegal comes into the equation for me. Senegal is important too because when it comes to the succession crisis in the Kingdom of Congo in the 1850s, we usually think of that crisis in the context of the Portuguese making inroads in the lower Congo, and I myself did that. But the picture is more complicated. You're going to have the Portuguese, in fact, vying for influence in that area with the British, which usually we think of the British as the main rivals, but also the French. And the French are using Senegal as a basis to do that, to make inroads southwards into West Central Africa in ways that are sometimes very successful. They took, for example, about 27,000 people from the lower Congo to their colonies in the Caribbean, and that took place in the 1850s. And in addition to that, they became also players in this succession crisis in the Kingdom of Congo. They had their own candidate for the throne of the kingdom. So they were like competing with the Portuguese to interfere in that political process.
Thank you, Rocky. And we have a question from Tyler, which I hope I can unmute. Was I able to unmute you, Tyler? Yes?
Yes. Thank you so much. How you doing? I'm an undergraduate history major at University of Southern California. I read your book about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed the presentation very much. Please forgive me. I was in the process of picking up my daughter. It's raining here in Los Angeles. I'm in my car, but I'm pulled over. I'm safe. I have a quick question. I have a quick question for you. It's a two-parter. One, what was your most enjoyable area of study, whether it be in any part of the book, whether it be in an archive or a specific location? And lastly, what, if you could say at all, which project are you working on next? Where are you setting your sights to after this? Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question. Enjoyable. I think I did the book out of a little bit of politics in terms of changing the conversation, in terms of centering Africa. Not politics very much capitalized, right? So I wanted to make a contribution in terms of the intellectual debates in our field. So it's difficult for me to think in terms of enjoying, because when we read these sources, in fact, there's just so much suffering, there's just so much violence that one can even have nightmares. And I can tell you that because I did have nightmares, because it's just like it drains you emotionally. You can't really like think of this as an object, it's not, you realize that you're not a scientist. I mean, the scientists that will go there in a very objective way, they will do things in a very impersonal. We spend so much time immersed with these things that it probably takes a toll on us, even when we don't really fully realize. So yeah, so that's I don't know if my reaction makes sense here. The next project, I have several things going on. One of them has to do with Mozambique, and there's a project on the era of revolutions, and that traces people going from Goa into Mozambique and back to Goa and then into Brazil. It's like it's more of an imperial history of Portugal, quote unquote. but looking at these non-European players. So looking at the empire from below and from the edges of empire. Is multi-sided, so which means it's going to take a very long time to become an article or a book.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Tyler. I don't know if you have any more questions. I would have one. Then my question would be, Rocky, for you to talk a little bit of what you have on the one hand on chapter 6, because this question is connected to what Ashley asked. Then, of course, that your focus has been Angola. And this book, as you are moving to this period that is then more 19th century, then you focus on the Luango coast, which is an area where we had multiple then the European actors since an early period, including the French. And in chapter 6, you have all this discussion about Maison Régis. Then I would like, and then they were in that area in West Central Africa, but they were also then in what became then the Republic of Benin in Dahomey. Then in that period then of transition then from the slave trade to colonialism. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that dimension, because here you have this new organization of these companies that were allegedly involved in the what we call the legitimate trade, but they were indeed fully then involved also in what you define in the book as unfreedom. Then and we explained then the issue of these indentured servants that are sent to the Caribbean, but the line then separating what was enslavement and what was freedom or indentured servitude is very thin. And I just asked myself if you would like to talk a little bit more about that dimension.
That's a very good question. This company from Marseille, very global company that actually the business stretches into the Indian Ocean. So whoever wants to write a history that connects the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, I think that company would provide a very good framework to do that, because it's just extremely global. And in addition to this thing of unfreedom, labor regimes, right? They will enable that. They will drive that. For example, the new forced migration from the lower Congo to the Caribbean was put together by the company, by the Regis company. So they had the infrastructure to do that. It all started in Senegal for them in terms of the African footprint, but then they will multiply themselves, right, all over the place and into the Indian Ocean. But in addition to this issue of labor regimes, and they're very important in terms of putting that together, and this fuzziness between slavery and new forms of forced labor, I would say that they're shaping French empire making on the ground. That was fascinating for me. They had lots of leeway, so the agents would go to meet the Dahomey Kingdom, and they were calling the shots on the ground. So, and I understand that's a very specific phase of French empire making, because it takes place kind of in a private space in a way. Of course, the state is always looming larger, but they do a lot on the ground. So the company was very interesting for me. I felt like I could have gone on and on looking at that company. Of course, that was not the primary focus of the chapter, but the company, my interest in the company was tiny little, was peripheral, and then it became much larger as I realized how important of a player they were across the African continent.
Thank you, Rocky. Let's see if we have more questions. I don't see them, I think. Last chance for whoever would like to bring more questions, or Alex. I don't want to monopolize. So I don't think that today they are like silent, but one of the reasons is also that people are still catching up with the book, and now you have a good idea about the book and what it looks like. And then once again, Worlds of Unfreedom, West Central Africa in the Era of Global Abolition. And this is a book by historian Roquinaldo Ferreira, published with Princeton University Press, 2025. And I really hope that you read the book. Then this is going to stay on YouTube. And now I see two questions that are emerging. So we are going to continue. Let's go. I will start with Iris and then with Anna. Iris, please.
Thank you, Ana Lucia. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to hear you, Rocky. I am very curious about your book, and I will try to get it this year, I hope. Just I want to know if you are planning to translate it to Portuguese, if you have any editorial house in contact, because it will be nice to publish at the USP editorial university. So let me know about the Portuguese version. Thank you.
So I actually don't have anyone interested in publishing the book in Brazil until now, apparently. So I would be more than happy to reach out to you to talk about that. It would be wonderful to be able to do that. We have to publish these things in English for obvious reasons, but my conversations are with obviously people here, people everywhere, but I'm very much Brazil-centered, intellectually, existentially, and emotionally. So publishing in Brazil is a big deal for me.
Let's try.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, we encourage it. And whoever else is watching this, I think that this is an important dimension, because Brazilians, they always ask when it's going to be published in Portuguese. But to this to happen, Brazilians based in Brazil, they need to make the efforts to have these books published in Brazil. It's very hard for anyone in the US alone to be able to do that. Thank you, Iris. Now, Anna, let me add Anna. Okay, I think that, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, got it.
Here, sorry.
Thank you. I didn't ask this question before because it wasn't a content-oriented question. I also don't have the book yet. I'm in Brazil. I teach at UNB, so I don't have the book yet, but I will look forward to reading it. But I wanted to know, Hoki, about what you did for 5 years to reshape the book, because I was very curious about that from the perspective of the craft of writing, and what was it that forced you to go back and reshape, because I'm sure that actually that's what's made it a very strong book. So I wonder if you could just talk about that, because sometimes we're so rushed to publish things. I actually thought that was not a negative. I thought it was a positive.
That's how I would like to think. What happened? I mean, first the pandemic, right, which destabilized us, and the architecture of my family life that changed a lot, and that lots of energy that I would have otherwise devoted to the book, I could not do that for a little while. But it's also my fault, because I felt like I could make the book better, and I wanted to go back and into the manuscript and rewrite. But I don't know if it, to be honest, I would have to compare the two manuscripts. I don't know. Is it really much better than what it was in 2019? Some people here might have read the manuscript, the previous version. I think Tatiana might have done that, and maybe Ana Lucia too. So, but in my sense, I don't know. I keep wondering if it made sense to go back. It felt like I got stuck into a rabbit hole, right? Like you guys say in English.
No, I think that the book is that it is, of course, the more you work, it's not in terms of that you were doing more research necessarily, but it's in terms of the book is more readable, and then you had more time to think. I think that is a better manuscript for sure. So. And of course, when you read like this, it doesn't have the same taste that when we read a book in the manuscript and on words. So then people will enjoy the book. We have one more question, and then this is going to be the last one. Let me see. Sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, Shamsudi. Can you unmute yourself?
Sure.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for sharing this link to this call publicly for enthusiasts like me who are living also very far away to be able to join. And let me put a caveat that I haven't yet read the book, but I would like to know whether the book did talk about accounts that had to do with returnee previous slaves as part of the efforts around abolishing in those periods that the book covered. So if you can speak about that and whether the book did actually cover that ground, that would be great. Thank you, everyone. And congratulations for the book.
Thank you so much. Actually, I don't deal with that subject. You don't have a big flow of returnees to that region, to West Central Africa. When we teach, we always deal with this back to Africa movements. It's fascinating, right? We know quite a bit of that through the work of our colleagues and scholars. But in the context of West Central Africa, as far as I know, and I could always be wrong, there's not a sizable or meaningful flow of returnees. It's not like, say, the Gold Coast or the Bight of Benin. So no, that doesn't really come up. But thank you for the question.
Oh, okay, then thank you so much. I think that we are going to stop here. And I hope that those who are not here with us will watch on YouTube, and then that we continue this kind of conversation once you'll be reading the book and also discussing the book in the seminars and other places where you are exchanging about these ideas. Roque, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for presenting the book. And thank you so much for this beautiful book, and so good to see you, and hope to see you in person soon as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.